So hello, everybody. Again, amazing panel. There's so much I want to say, just following just Kayleen and with the gentleman, like just amazing. But I know we're at time here, so and I want to be mindful of the presenters afterwards. So hamadaki api tashinaziwi machiapi na peta atakile washelo. So hello, everybody. My name is Sadie Redwing. I am a citizen of Sprit Lake Dakota Nation. I'm going to transition into sharing my screen here as I kind of chat, and within this presentation we're going to switch gears in kind of thinking about if you were to take a class. So just to kind of give an idea of what I do within at OCADU. So I am coming into this conversation as a professor at OCADU. I teach in 2 departments. I teach it within the Department of Design as well as with the Indigenous Visual Culture program with emphasis on Indigenous materials and methods. But outside of my work and outside of my research, I'm actually presenting a new lecture here. So this is new compared to some of the previous lectures that I've given in the past or thinking within workshops. But again, we're still really building. We're still really building resources for curriculum. We're still building sample assignments, but even just, being in a position to really curate a curriculum where we can get Indigenous students ready to go design for their nation. So in this presentation here, so I'm gonna go through a little bit of introduction to myself and really focus on history, how history has, how history is written for the practice of graphic design. And then also, if we were gonna write our own textbook starting at history, what would be included in that space. So this is kind of not necessarily type focus. I wouldn't, and when we kind of think about how the panel was mentioning presses, we're really going to start focusing on materials, or even how we start to document, or how do we look at historical documentation or forms of archiving or visually communicating in that aspect. So just to give a preference of where I'm coming from, what ideology I'm bringing into the space. My citizenship is within the Sprit Lake Dakota Nation. So if you can see my cursor, that little square up by Devil's Lake within the Fort Town, North Dakota area, but you might hear myself refer as Lakota. I'm also Cheyenne River Lakota. And then my folks are where I'm from in Central South Dakota, so within Eagle Butte, Pierre area. But just in thinking about coming into the space as a Lakota Dakota, with this emphasis in thinking about TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, or what the natural resources, I'm going to focus on this lecture specifically, is going to be Great Plains based. So think of traditional grasslands, prairie, these frameworks that I'll be sharing, or just an example, it's just going to be a little bit more resources related to the grasslands. But again, in thinking about there's other regions within the whole continent that could utilize these frameworks, but just to kind of give a little bit emphasis, coming from a Great Plains or coming from a grasslands tribe, there's a lot of aspects of being nomadic. So think nomadic, grasslands, grass, and it'll make sense once we kind of get into a little bit, but just to kind of show like the last 5 years, before the pandemic, traveled across the nation, given the Fuck the Stereotype presentation. It's nice that we're progressing from stereotypes and we can move into more in-depth conversations around this. So I always kind of highlight about that. But I think what has been most of my excitement and what gives me passion in thinking about where my goals are set, and I think is it Sebastian that might have said it, like the work that we're doing now, we may not even experience it in the future, but we got to get it situated, or we got to get the frameworks down. So I always tell myself, man, it's 2022. We don't have like a design institute, like not necessarily a tribal college, but like a design institute where it is focused on like design systems and just anything around design, particularly it comes from here. And just to mind you, some of my graphics are a little bit corny, or just like a little bit, there's some goofy gifs in here, but again, just in thinking about a student who might be coming into my class, trying to give them a little bit of excitement. And then you can kind of notice that based on some of these slides in here, but just really think about if I were to build a curriculum, if I am going to be in a position to make a design school, we're going to talk about everything. But again, if we're going to start with history and thinking about our canon, and we'll get into that definition in a second, but really thinking about if I was going to teach graphic design at a design institute, and I'm bringing a framework of TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, there are going to be things that I'm going to need to train designers so that we're not relying on pan-Indian imagery and stereotypes when we're targeting an audience to a specific region. So I'm thinking about this is lecture is really tailored to people who would just have no competency of Indigenous languages. So if you are non-Indigenous, working on this lecture for you, but just in thinking about, other than using patterns and shapes, like we need plants, like if we're going to do florals, how many floral, different floral visual languages are across the nation, and animals, we're gonna need some animal tropes, we're gonna need some animal products, and we'll get into that when we talk about reciprocity. Landscapes, I bring this concept around landscapes and think about developing color palettes, but just in thinking about all these natural resources that we would need in order to teach graphic design for Indigenous students. And that is within this framework of traditional ecological knowledge. So TEK, and we'll define that a little bit more, but in thinking about one of the reasons why we're struggling, and particularly who those might work within the graphic design focus, or even students who are being brought in as experts into places, is that there's not a lot of graphic design history documented of how design was before contact. So just even think about, like, if we were going to write, everybody in this conference, we're going to write a textbook of graphic design history of, before 1492, like what would be in it? But just in thinking about, how do we even learn about graphic design? Like when we come in and we're taking history classes, we're taking communication classes, we're talking about how we're communicating, and think about how it's taught from a Western aspect. So I was introduced to this realm of semiotics. So semiotics was like the first term that I really learned, and think about signing. How do we communicate with signs? And think about, what's the definition of symbols? How are symbols different than icons? And how are symbols and icons different than indexes? And really thinking about how we use symbols to document, how we use to communicate, how we use to record, or just even like archive, or just even in thinking about, and again, I wish I had more time to go on another lecture and thinking about, we might see more floral icons and maybe woodlands, Anishinaabe, visual languages, but some of those same florals might be symbols based within like the plains area, traditional grasslands area. So just even getting our students to know the difference between a symbol and icon, because in general conversation, I know that we confuse those terms often. So, and think about when I took graphic design history at the Institute of American Indian Arts, like this was it, like this was our textbook, or quote unquote Bible, which is in thinking about when I'm talking about when I get frustrated why there is an Indigenous design or shared within these graphic design history textbooks. There's just, kind of a lack of a focus. And then, for those and thinking about, if you haven't seen the word, new to the word canon, just kind of thinking about how history has like trained a designer to do what they do. But just in thinking about, in this graphic design, a new history textbook, they reference forms of communication that might be, icon and symbol based, or glyph based, or picto based, or, or however whatever terminology you want to use, but just to kind of say that there's been times I've been so frustrated. I'm like, man, like we learn about Egyptian forms of writing and graphic design, what is so beautiful and I love, and they highlight it. They could do a little bit more in acknowledging our Aztec, our Mayan, or just our Indigenous relatives in Mexico who are looking to push for their sovereign recognition too. So and think about how we're creating this. We got to think about them who are not federally recognized yet. So these frameworks are going to be useful in the future. Of course, we learn about the Greeks, or the Roman alphabet, those little chisels within the stone. But in thinking about that, is not like indigenous, or other than our relatives in Mexico or South America, there isn't much documentation in a graphic design history book around, how we documented in the United States. You might see that in an art history book, a North American art history book at museums, or just even like it's just not present in how we would learn about graphic design. Because when we think about graphic design, you think about like Dada, Surrealism, Postmodernism, get into New Wave, blah, 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 like all those eras. But we have all those eras too. It's just not in a textbook form, but within thinking about Canon. And I do want to, my students know that, not that I vent about Johann Gutenberg, when we get into the printing press, there are just some things that, just to remind us that the printing press wasn't here particularly, or it doesn't work in a nomadic lifestyle. It doesn't work in a nomadic identity, but just even thinking about, how we can navigate and critique how the printing press is. So Johann Gutenberg had this amazing printing press. It was a good invention when it came into mass communication. So just in thinking about, man, they did a really good job just pushing out Bibles. And man, could you imagine like what this world would look like if Johann said, all right, guys, after the 10th Bible that we print, like let's grow a tree or two. But just in thinking about like, if you come from a nomadic lifestyle where you are always on the move, like we're not necessarily going to be in a position to have a printing press. If you think about it, like we're going to need probably wood to make the press. We're going to need some metal. We're going to need some paper. We're definitely going to need some ink. So when you're really thinking about like how, just you have to be in a position where you got to stay in one place and utilizing the printing press. And then what is communicated outside the printing press will be mobile, but it doesn't necessarily work when you're nomadic. And I always and I tease and I joke with my students saying like, like I come from an identity where we're on the move, like we're camping, like we're setting up camp, taking down camp. Like my poor horse, like I would not want to be the one to have the horse pulling all the printing press, pulling all those books. So just even thinking about like, that's just a lot of stuff to really, one of the reasons why like the printing press isn't necessarily indigenous to this area, but then even more so and thinking about the use of those resources, needing wood, needing just our addiction to paper and how that has devastated to deforestation. But again, that's kind of a little bit more into the exploitation aspect. But if you can really start to think about this concept of like matter, just not, I don't want to say waste, but just in thinking about how in education we're so dependent on and think about citations, works cited, how it comes in the forms of books. So when think about words get longer, sentences get longer, pages get longer, books get thicker. As books start to pile up, more books are getting made, bookshelves, and thinking about, I think I got bookshelves going to libraries. Think about libraries, mass, books. Just even thinking about like, that's a lot of stuff. Like there'd be no way a nomadic tribe can carry all that stuff. And then libraries get made into big, like big buildings and institutions. So it's like, it's progressive, just a means of that's a lot. It's not really eco-friendly, but even more so that doesn't necessarily fit to a nomadic lifestyle because we can't be carrying everything. So I know I'm getting close to time, but I'm going to go through these last things a little bit quickly. So if we're not focusing our graphic design research on the printing press, and we're bringing in TEK into these spaces, now we have to give evidence of how we document it. So if we didn't have the printing press, if we didn't have the books, how are we archiving this knowledge? And how did we help remember some of the oral histories that we have? So coming from South Dakota, and again, this is kind of showing like, this is what it's going to look like about February here, or even now as the plains have been getting distant. But some folks, when I travel, they never see the buffalo. They might not know what the terrain is, but just think about that models of reciprocity. So if I am thinking about our forms of documentation as Lakota people, we have things like winter counts, but we really utilize the buffalo for everything. And I bring that framework of reciprocity when we're talking about land preservation or regeneration or even decolonization, because in order to have the resources of the buffalo and to have winter counts or just even how we can have hide to document on, we're going to have tall grass. So again, this don't want to necessarily focus on the concept of reciprocity, but I never thought I'd be advocating for grass just because we need the buffalo. And there's even showing more so like if I was talking about why buffalo is important in tilling soil to keep grass alive, I could document it in an image like this. So hopefully you can see my cursor. I know the background's white, but my cursor is white. But if we can have the symbol of the buffalo here, I don't need to read a 300-page book of how the weight of the buffalo pushes seeds. If I know that the buffalo and the sun, so if you can see in the corners here, that little sun allows for the grass for us to grow flowers and for our flowers to, kind of bloom. Like this would be one example of symbols kind of documenting that process of, reciprocity. Buffaloes, sun, flowers, just to kind of, there's my timer here. But just to kind of wrap up, but just to kind of give an example, like if we want to talk about winter counts, if we want to talk about symbols, we're gonna need to know buffalo. Like we're gonna need to know and understand that these forms of documenting within symbols, within histories, are useful in preserving languages or bringing oral histories. It's just challenging because they don't come in a form of a textbook. They come in form of maybe a visual, maybe in form of a symbol. And if you can kind of see, and again, these are just examples of how we're bringing in some of that ledger work, or again, needing that buffalo hide, or just needing some type of I guess, historical evidence, because when we're bringing in these visual languages into, let's say, branding projects, or we're talking about languages, man, like the Lakota, like we have so many different dictionaries. I don't know how many people like get on to me about spelling, but she's like, man, like my family's dictionaries are outdated and we don't have the new dictionaries. But just even talking about dictionaries, and if we were going to brand a dictionary, you know, we might bring in some of those ledger or just even some of those leather pieces, and think about color palettes. I know the panel was mentioning about color palettes, but again, going back to like other than you know, just how we might have particular type of colors within regions. So our flowers in the prairie are different than the flowers in the desert. We have an illustrator, like we could be bringing in all these color palettes when we start to really brand and kind of see how we utilize these images. And I want to give one last example within the plains, and I'll wrap up with other regions here. But like the buffalo porcupine quill, when we're talking about how like visual languages might come from that grid space. So if you're weaving porcupine quills and you're weaving, or you're, you know, kind of within stringing, some type of resource like within beading, how some of that output can be brought into say a line space. So we kind of read this visual language because we could document where the emphasis comes from. I blast this image on here, the quill work of the Western Sioux. Carrie, remember, like this was written like in the 40s. So there's been a lot of progression. But within what Carrie mentions that I appreciate in this work is, she said, you know, when men would go to war, they would write on their shields with paint. So when you look at war shields, or you look at drums, like a lot of that is more like finger based. But if you want to if you're going to contrast that to something that might be woven, something that might be a little bit of 8-bit, that might be a little bit more symbol form, not necessarily icon form. Icons might necessarily be on the finger, not, I don't want to say finger paint, but like the paints within the finger, but within the icon form, or yeah, within the symbol form, it might take a little bit learning on how we can translate what those symbols may mean. So this is within my thesis from North Carolina State, trying just to get the symbols in novice users' hands. And then even just bringing that. So again, like if we are utilizing maybe a syntax within symbols, it's not necessarily going to be a textbook focus. Like I can learn about a family history seeing this, and I don't need to read it, or I don't need to look at ledgers, or I don't need to look at a family tree. So lastly, I'm going to wrap up, just give a shout out to the region, but just to think about recording devices, invention, design, we're geniuses, how we utilize the bead to remind us of something, a dream catcher, or not, or for allow us to remind us something within record. These are contemporary pieces, but again, documenting like time when the railroads were coming over within just on, I could read this and know and see a historical when trains came within the Southwest. I don't need to read, you know, like a big document, but again, I think everyone's kind of getting the point. Wampum, just within textiles or woven or within the coastal form line, and again, just based on the region and how we use all these symbols, icons, and indexes within our semiotics. It's just a little bit more TEK focused. So that school is going to come one of these days. But again, just I wish we had a little bit more time, but I'm going over my time now. And again, I just want to thank everybody coming to this, and I'm looking forward to the conversations afterwards. So I appreciate the time during today.